Okay, so I think we'll move on. So our next talk is another in-person talk from Babajanyan.
Okay. How is it that when we perform tasks that involve moving objects with others, such as stacking the dishwasher or handing around a bottle of sanitizer, we can do this relatively seamlessly every time, regardless of who we interact with and without having to verbally communicate or make any explicit plans? These sorts of interpersonal tasks, just like many everyday activities, involve pick and place actions. And these entail selecting an object, grasping it, and then moving it to a particular location, either by oneself or by passing it to someone else first. So to answer that question I just posed, the ecological dynamics framework proposes that motor behavior spontaneously emerges in response to perceived action possibilities of an object. These are termed affordances and can be determined by the environment, the task, and individual parameters. For example, the affordance of a dish in the cupboard could be its graspability, and that might be determined by the shelf of the cupboard and the height of the participant. So it's thought that if we can model these affordances, then we should be able to predict the action decisions that humans make using very few parameters. Importantly, we can use these affordance-based models to develop and train artificial agents to behave in a human-like manner in order to have seamless human-agent interactions. And that's becoming increasingly important with growing integration of artificial agent and robotic technologies in human settings. So this is the overarching aim of our research. When it comes to modeling action decisions in these pick and place tasks, including pickup decisions, dropping off, and passing, there's actually very minimal research. However, one experimental study that used participants moving virtual disc-shaped objects found that we can actually capture these pick and place action decisions using these lower dimensional affordance-based models. However, movements in this study were quite limited and it was only occurring within a 2D plane. They also only used a simple task design. So our study aimed to identify and model the dynamics of pick and place action decisions within a less restrictive and 3D task design, as well as examine the effect of increasing complexity of the task on the action decision dynamics. And in order to achieve this, we used a 3D virtual reality interpersonal pick and place task. So the task itself required participants to work in pairs to sort through virtual cylindrical objects of 5 different colors. They had to pick the objects up that appeared in dispenser tubes on one side of the table, and then move them across the table and drop them off in the correspondingly colored collector tubes. And they could do this either by themselves or by passing it to their co-actor. And they completed the task using one headset and one controller each. So participants were represented as these red avatars, and they completed both simple and complex versions of the task. And I'll show you a quick example of what those look like. So here is a video example of the simple task version where a virtual object could appear only one at a time. And to pick up or drop off the objects, participants simply had to reach the object with our controller or approach the correct tube with the controller as well. And to pass objects, participants had to bring their controllers together. So this example shows you what passing looked like and how this was performed. And in the complex trial, the objects could appear more than once simultaneously, so up to 5 objects could be present at the table, and participants could also pass objects by bringing both their controllers together. If they're both holding one, they could perform a swap, so this was done at the same time. The task was completed in pairs by 32 participants from an Australian university, and we had 1,300 trials altogether. Each pair completed 2 blocks of the simple and the complex trials, and the order of this was counterbalanced. Participants were asked to refrain from talking and to complete the trials as quickly as possible. This allowed us to investigate the interpersonal action decisions as they naturally evolve without having any explicit planning or verbal communication. So in that task, we manipulated where the object appeared and then where it also had to be dropped off. And we used body scaled ratios as measures of affordances in order to predict action decisions. So these decisions involved who picked up the object, who dropped it off, and did a pass occur or not. These ratios were adapted from previous research, and they included standing object distance and standing target distance. So these were calculated as a planar distance from the headset to where the object appeared, or the headset to where the object had to be dropped off for its target. Both of these were divided by arm length to account for the fact that participants had different reach capacities. We also measured the time that it took participants to pick up a given object, and that was normalized by how far away the object appeared. So in order to identify the behavioral dynamics of pickup and pass decisions, we tested models adapted from previous pick and place research using multi-level regression analyses. And we determined for the most part that adding any new measures of affordances like 3D measures or measures from the hand as opposed to body position didn't significantly improve the model's predictive power and often demonstrated severe multicollinearity. So only the most parsimonious models will be presented here. So for object pickup decisions, we identified a clear trend where participants tended to pick up almost 100% of the time objects that appeared on their side of the table. And there are relatively equal pickups for objects that were dispensed relatively equidistantly to both participants. This was both for the simple and the complex trials. Participants also favored picking up objects that had to be dropped off on their side of the table, but this trend was less obvious, especially in the complex trials. We demonstrated that a model that used standing object distance correctly classified which player would pick up an object 92% of the time, where participants became significantly more likely to pick up an object when it appeared, when it was closer to them, and we controlled for reach in that as well. For passing decisions, we identified that participants tended to pass objects that had to be dropped off on their co-actor's side of the table, and this was approximately 92% of the time. So that allowed the participant having to drop off the object to reach the target more easily. However, these heuristic rules were less obvious in the complex trials, where participants were more likely to take on uncomfortable reaching. We demonstrated also that models using standing target distance were able to correctly predict if a pass occurred or not, 94% of the time in the simple tasks, where the further away the target location was, controlling for reach, the more likely participants became to then pass that object. But that same model only classified 83% of decisions in the complex trials. But when we incorporated the participants and their co-actor standing target distance in the model, we demonstrated significantly greater discrimination by that model, with a new model being able to predict 88% of past decisions. We also used a k-means cluster analysis in order to identify where within the 3D Euclidean plane passes tended to occur. And we found that in simple trials, there appeared to be 2 centrally located passing clusters. One was closer to each participant. And participants tended to pass in the cluster that was closest to their co-actor, thus minimizing the amount of distance the co-actor then had to move. However, in complex trials, we found that there appeared to be a single central passing cluster, and this could be due to the fact that 75% of passes were actually part of a swap. So that suggests that participants tended to coordinate passes in a way that maximized overall task efficiency. We also used multi-level linear regression models, and we showed that the time it took for participants to pick up an object significantly varied depending on where that object appeared. Specifically, the further away that object was dispensed from the center of the table, the faster it was picked up. So to explain this, we propose that when there's an obvious difference in the graspability affordance, for example, when an object is dispensed in the furthest tubes and is therefore much closer to only one of two participants, then individuals will rely on automatic heuristic rules in order to make fast decisions that are based on division of labor boundaries. However, when this division of labor is less obvious, for example, for objects that were dispensed in the middle tube, there might be some hesitancy around who should pick up that object. So participants may rely on slower, more conscious feedback systems or participant hierarchy to make the decision instead. In complex trials, objects tended to be picked up much slower, and there was a significant interaction on where the object appeared and where it had to be dropped off on pickup time. Specifically, participants again took longer to pick up objects that had unclear division of labor. So this could have been objects that were dispensed in the central tube and then had to be dropped off in the central tube as well, or certain objects that had to be passed. So what does all of this actually mean? Well, overall, action decisions in interpersonal 3D pick-and-place tasks seem to follow certain heuristic rules, mainly around division of labor boundaries, and these serve the purpose of maximizing task efficiency by minimizing the overall movement of the dyad. For example, pickup decisions are primarily driven by how close an object is to the individual controlling for reach, where the closer it is, the more likely it is to be picked up by that person. And decisions to pass an object instead of dropping it off by yourself, these are largely driven by how far away the target is controlling for reach, where the further away the object or the target is from the individual and the closer the target is to their co-actor, the more likely the individual is then to pass that object. So this suggests that individuals are more likely to engage in interpersonal behavior when a task goal is perceived as unattainable by oneself. However, in tasks with greater demands, such as loading the dishwasher instead of passing someone your keys, may be less reliant on these heuristic rules, as individuals will be more likely to take on uncomfortable tasks in order to prioritize the task completion speed. And this was seen in the complex trials that we had. And when division of labor is less obvious, this may be reflected in slower decision speed. Our findings also demonstrated how a greater number of parameters may modulate the action decisions people make when the number of decisions having to be made increase. So ultimately, our findings demonstrate that these low-dimensional models based on affordances may be able to accurately predict multi-dimensional pick-and-place tasks with varying complexity. So this suggests that interpersonal action decisions in many everyday tasks might be inherently predictable using merely physical task and individual parameters instead of having to measure any cognitive or neurological constructs. So why is it important to model these actions? Well, previous research has shown that we can use such models to develop artificial agents by setting human movement constraints for a task. And since pick-and-place tasks are so common in everyday personal and occupational settings, such as assembly line production, the implications of having these action decision models are vast. But more importantly, these models, as opposed to deep reinforcement learning techniques, may be used to develop artificial agents that might be more human-like in order to have these seamless human-agent interactions. An example of these interactions could include motor rehabilitation or social skill training, or even socially assistive robotic helpers for older people, geriatric populations. So, to take a step in this direction, our lab is currently investigating and developing an artificial agent based on dynamic motor primitives and then the low-dimensional models that were evaluated in our study. And these will be evaluated in terms of their human likeness when interacting with other humans, as opposed to human agent interactions with deep reinforcement agents or human-human interactions as well. Thank you for listening. I would be happy to take on any questions you might have.
So seems, I'm sure that affordances are playing a big role here, but I'm wondering in a slightly different descriptive level, how much of what you observe in these tasks would be due to efforts to minimize time or effort in these tasks, either in the task or in carryover from life, where we tend to minimize time and effort?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And definitely what we saw in our study and also just in previous research is that in tasks such as these, when we are collaborating with someone else and we have a shared goal, we tend to pick decisions or trajectories that do minimize overall movement. So we're acting more effectively and more efficiently. So often the decisions that we make do try to maximize the efficiency, as you said. There is a theory, it's called the shared effort model, I think has been developed about a decade ago, that showed, and they suggested that the decisions that we make in dyadic interactions try to maximize efficiency. So as we saw in the passing decisions, yes, affordances are a big part of that, but also the decisions that we made when passing were made in a way that minimized the overall movement. So we pass in a location so that our coactor can easily then pick that object up and then reach the target. We're not passing somewhere that is on the other side of the table. We're passing sort of in the midpoint. And even with pickup decisions, we are picking up objects that are closer to us. So that's more efficient than picking up objects that are very far away. And instead of then, if the target is very far, we're not trying to reach all the way over, we're passing it. So it's in the midpoint. Our coactor is receiving it and then they are dropping it off. So definitely all the movements here seem to maximize efficiency. It was only in the complex conditions that we found that sometimes decisions didn't quite maximize efficiency, but instead participants were just trying to act quickly. So they might have not been efficient movements, but they were just quick. Did that answer your question?
This is more of a speculative question. Have you thought about or considered the possibility that rationally selfish robots with artificial intelligence might develop a bit of a free rider problem, in the sense that offloading things to the other party in a collaborative situation?
Yeah, that's an interesting question as well. I think it depends on how that artificial agent is developed. So the types of agents that we were looking at then developing in our lab are based on models. So they're based on these low dimensional affordance-based models where free riding shouldn't be a problem unless the human participant decides to take advantage of the fact that there is a robot, and then the free rider would become the human in that sense, because the robot or the artificial agent will be picking up objects when they are closer to that robot. They won't be trying to, I guess, in a way, stand further away, so they are not, then the model is not predicting the artificial agent to do these tasks. But if we were to use deep reinforcement learning techniques, it might be different. It just depends on what sort of material we use to train that artificial agent. In the type of human-human interactions we were having, there didn't appear to be any free rider problems. So we saw relatively equal pickups, relatively equal drop-offs for participants within the pair, and this was the same across all pairs. So if we use that data to then train an artificial agent, I don't think we would see a free rider problem, but it definitely depends on where we're getting the data or what sort of models we're using. Yeah. Okay, I think that's all. Thank you so much for listening.